I've been enjoying reading your pilot study proposals that have been up there and your analysis paragraphs. It reminds me of what good work you did last quarter. It's really, everything is so very close. I'm mostly working on little organizational details and sentence level details. I want to give you an example of an analysis section paragraph that was really excellent. This is Martine's, and I've actually cut some pieces out just so I can give it to you in a kind of succinct way. But I want to kind of point out different things that he did. So first of all, you can see here that he writes the goal for his data analysis. So he was very clear about what his goal was here. Then there's several stages he went through. He says, initially, I was determined to use an inductive approach. And he felt that he needed the data from the 4 students to speak for themselves. So he's sort of justifying his initial inductive approach. He wants to listen for the students' voices. And then I love this. I leaned heavily on descriptive coding or summarizing a summation of the responses within the interview, right? This is very clear, and he cites Saldana. This is exactly what he was doing descriptive coding. Then he says, okay, well, there was a problem here. So the next step, which is in blue, I encountered a second review of the data. I began to see patterns that connected to my literature, and then he talks a little bit about his positionality and finally using deductive or a priori methods to see whether the initial codes were reflected in the literature, essentially. So you can see how this is a little bit conversational, but that's okay. He's really literally recording this process he went through, why he did the first stage, what it made him think, how that caused him to think about doing the second stage, what the second stage brought. And then he writes here, in the end, the deductive process helped me discover patterns within the data that resonated strongly with the primary themes that emerged from the literature. So he's saying what he found. And that he was able to see oppositional data, right? So he's able to see things that are opposite to the literature. So here's a key thing between your analysis paragraph and your findings. In your analysis paragraph, you don't get into detail about what you found. That's where what you put in the findings. You just briefly mention that I found things related to the literature, or that, many key themes related to the literature emerged, or new themes that were not related to the literature emerged, or things like that. And you'll see that to a greater or lesser extent in people's methods when you read methods in articles. All right, I'm going to be talking about an example of findings from a mixed methods study. And in the process, I'm going to be talking about alignment across introduction, lit review, methods, findings, and conclusion. So here's how I'm going to go through this. Your pilot study report, all of these things need to be aligned with the research question: the introduction, lit review, methods, findings, and conclusion. I'm first going to outline how this article, which was written by myself and a couple of colleagues and is under review, how this article aligns each of these things with the research question. Then I'm going to dig into the findings as another example of how to write up your findings, and then later on I'll use it as an example for writing up your conclusion. The entire article is already available under week 6 as part of the resources. So it's a great example if you want to see a mixed methods example in the works. And I just did a little cartoon here for you for comic relief. The backbone's connected to the thigh bone, and the thigh bone's connected to the knee bone, except they get it wrong. So here we have Exhibit A. This is kind of an outline of this paper that I'm providing as an example, based on the parts that you have for your pilot study report. So I first want to draw your attention to the research questions. To what extent do teachers enact targeted classroom instructional practices after engaging in a 4-month intensive NGSS stewardship integrated PD? So essentially I'm saying, did teachers change their practice after the PD? And the second question is, what are the processes which shape teacher change? in their change in practice? All right, so it's a two-part question. This may be something you should think about for your dissertation. One is, did they change their practice? The second is, what shaped the change in practice? Now, going up to the introduction, this is kind of a sentence or two that encapsulates the argument, okay? The environmental education field has encountered persistent challenges in fostering the integration of EE in public schools, a challenge that may be addressed through PD that integrates environmental education with NGSS. So I'm saying, you know, there is a persistent problem in education, which is that environmental education doesn't get into public schools. And hey, here's a potential solution. Maybe professional development could integrate environmental education with NGSS. And then I say, integration may also provide a unique opportunity for studying instructional change in the processes that shape it. So essentially, now I'm making the argument that, hey, we need to actually understand the processes that shape change, and therefore this may provide this opportunity. Okay, so moving into the literature review. Here are the things that I talked about in the literature review. And these are just bullet points rather than sentences. And you can see how these pertain to the research questions and everything else. One is prior research on teacher instructional change processes. So of course I would need to get into the prior research on instructional change because I'm asking questions about things that shape instructional change. And then there's prior research on science and environmental education, professional development, because it's in the context of a professional development. So you can see how these areas of literature that I review pertain directly to the questions that I'm asking. Next, in the methods, I say in mixed methods, the study examines the outcomes and processes of professional development. Surveys provided data on change in practice. Interviews provided data on the processes by which the change occurred. So I'm justifying my mixed methods. So I need surveys to understand change in practice, interviews to understand why it occurred. Findings, again, this is just a series of bullet points. Teachers exhibited substantive change in practice, and the key processes included 1, 2, 3, 4, a list of processes. Now, you can see here how this relates directly back to the research questions, right? The findings. Finding number 1 relates to research question 1. Did they do their change in practice? Finding number 2 relates to research question 2 about their processes. And then finally, in the conclusion, this study provides evidence regarding the benefit of using NGSS in combination with stewardship to infuse EE into classrooms. Note how this goes and relates to the introduction. And contributes to a theoretical understanding of the processes by which professional development shapes teacher change. Also relates to the introduction. So you can see a lot of repeated themes here. Trying to understand change, you know, whether the PD changed practices and what are the processes by which it did it. And those things are repeated iteratively throughout this set of of the introduction, lit review, methods, findings, and conclusion. In the following slides, I'm going to go over parts of this example that have to do with writing up your participants and your findings. Some of them are going to pertain to survey methods, and some of them are going to pertain to qualitative, because this is a mixed methods example. I would recommend that you listen to both, because I think kind of the continuum is applicable to all of your work. However, some of it is going to be slightly more applicable than others. So where I'm starting, the entire paper is uploaded as a PDF for you, so you can get a sense of the context if you want to read the whole paper. But what I want to talk about specifically are pieces that start in the methods. So you can see here in terms of participants. Now this is specific to mixed methods, and I'm going to pull out some things having to do with surveys. But in general, I want you to see this idea of justification. To facilitate the mixed methods design, we selected 2 samples. So I'm referring back to the design and then using that to talk about the samples that we drew, all right? And then the discussion of samples, etc. Now, for any of you, actually, whether you're doing interviews or surveys, I want to show you an example of writing up your participant. This is something that happens generally in detail after you do your study, right? So you propose certain participants in your proposal, but then after you do your study, you put the participants and their range and so forth here. So you can see I've included some demographic information about these folks that I think is important. Their teaching experience, the range and the average, their major, and then there's various other, and then there's two samples. I'm not going to talk about the second sample here. But you can see that I talk about here the purpose of selection of participants and what it was guided by. So again, justifying the sample, why we chose it, and what is important about it. All right. Now, both quant and qual may sometimes want to have a table. Here's the sample, here's the number of teachers at elementary, middle, et cetera, right? And then some demographics. And then here is some information about their schools. Now, clearly this is a much bigger study than your pilot study, but this is a sort of thing you would see in your dissertation. And some of you, especially those of you with surveys, may want to have tables in your pilot study to show your participants. And again, it goes in the methods under participants, not in the findings, generally speaking. I know Mary Kay, for example, has a little table describing her interview participants a little bit. I want to make just another note to clarify things here. For the folks who did qualitative research, this table right here is kind of what you might be looking at putting something like that in. Because you only interviewed 3 people, most of you, even that you don't really need. I mean, you just want to describe, maybe a table would be helpful to have like this person, this role, this amount of experience, here's where they work. That can be really helpful for your readers, and it can be a good kind of template for your dissertation later. This kind of thing is really only for the people who did survey research. So Tacey, Andrea, and Daryl are the ones who should be looking at that kind of thing. So I'm not asking you to go back and make a ton of changes. This is primarily for the survey folks who need to put their demographics up and their participants. Most of you have most of what you need for your participants. Just kind of letting you know that a table or a clear description of each person that you interviewed and kind of some of their traits is often helpful for the reader. This is primarily for the survey folks. This is a little bit about how the instrument is written up. So I asked you to write up your constructs in a table, and you can see here essentially how that is dropped directly into the instruments part of your methods. So first of all, up here you can see that I've described, we use the items from the instrument that corresponded with NGSS and stewardship practices. So I'm describing the constructs and where they originated. You can see the citation, and then you can see here where I've identified each construct in the definition and the items, right? So that should look familiar to you in terms of your work that you've already done. Now, this is something that Daryl, particularly, you may want to pay attention to. The past studies should have some validity and reliability data about these constructs, and you should include them in your table as well. And you can see here where this is a past study where I've included the validity number from the past study in here. You can also see that the analysis paragraph for quantitative analysis can often be shorter than the analysis paragraph for qualitative. So thinking about the balance, when you write up a survey or quantitative research, a lot of it is sort of about kind of the constructs and the validation of the constructs and that kind of thing. And the analysis is often, not always, but can be a bit shorter. I already discussed how there's 2 research questions in this paper. Research question 1, to the extent to which teachers enacted targeted classroom practices. And you can see how this is a quantitative question, the extent to which needs to be measured quantitatively. So the language around writing up the results, and by the way, this is my findings section. It's sometimes called results. Results from the stewardship survey demonstrated that teachers on average reported significant substantive shift in their practices over the course of the Institute. So I'm going pre to post, and I just come out and say it, right? Like there's been significant shifts, or the pre to post. And I did do a statistical test here, which is not something you're doing, but just generally just trying to show like you really just come out and say it. And you can see here that I've got a figure and that I've got a table with the data. So I put both in there. And also that you can see where I use the construct names, right? Although teachers rated themselves lowest on stewardship integration, data collection, and data collection analysis, right? So these are the names of two constructs that I've identified above in the methods. So you can see how the methods, you identify your constructs, you lay them out very clearly with definitions, and then in your findings now you just use those construct names and you talk about what they were rated, and you can see my numbers here in parentheses, and then of course in the tables and the figures. So again, I've already talked to you about research question 2, introduced it a little bit. What are the processes which shape teacher change, right? So this is the qualitative question. I've already demonstrated the quantitative results. They did change. And now I'm turning to the qualitative results. What are the processes by which they changed? And I've left a lot out here, but I'm going to show you a few things. So first of all, you can see that I started out with a figure that builds on someone else's figure and shows essentially what I found around change. So in this larger study, this is not, of course, something you're expected to do in a pilot study, but in this larger study, I have been able to formulate, like, here's this process that teachers went through. But figures, I'm showing this to you to show you that figures can be really helpful in making sense of complex relationships within the data. So you can see here I introduced the figure. The processes that emerge from this analysis are portrayed in figure 3, specifying the role of teacher beliefs, professional experimentation, reflection on outcomes, and sense making, et cetera, right? And then we provide evidence for each of these aspects below. So I'm leaving some signposts to guide my reader. To understand the processes that supported teacher reconsideration of their practices, I skipped a little bit, but I want to again show you some signposts that I left here in terms of introducing the processes. 4 themes that emerged while corresponding to Clark and Hollingsworth's past model also complexified it. And then I list the processes. They include the role of SEEF in exposing teachers to new information, the importance of requiring enactment, teacher observations of student reaction, and teacher sense making, right? So there are 4 things. You can see them coming up over and over again. There's like a, again, there's sort of helping your reader to see what's coming. And I know this is very different than a narrative style of writing for those of you who are good writers of stories and so forth, where you maybe want to have a surprise at the end. In this case, you can see start to finish that I've listed those 4 processes, and then I just, now I'm going to show you exactly what they look like. All right, and the example I'm going to show you is process 3, right? Observation of student excitement, engagement, and environmental stance. And in the next little video on this page, I'll talk a little bit about the introduction of that. All right, so moving down here, you can see how I introduced the theme, one of the most prominent aspects of the change process described by teachers. So I'm saying this is an important aspect by my use of the word prominent. And I'm using this word described by teachers. So this is something, again, I want to point out some language use in qualitative research, that this isn't an aspect of the change process, that we can state with absolute authority and truth. This is an aspect that was described by teachers. So I'm grounding it in the fact that this was interview data, not any other kind of data. All right, and then I say how many teachers talked about it to give a sense of why it was so important. And then I describe the theme, witnessing the excitement, engagement, and environmental stance of their students, and then help them overcome barriers. So in this case, there's a relationship. It's witnessing the excitement, help them overcome barriers, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate in the upcoming paragraphs. And here you can see the rest of the third theme. So first I start with a relatively long quote by a teacher who really kind of explains the entire relationship that I'm trying to show. We saw this excitement, and my partner teacher was a little leery, so she has some barriers. But now, now we've overcome it and the kids are really going with it. And you can see in the next little paragraph, I unpack this quote. This is a really long quote. I don't want to just leave my reader to try to understand it, right? This is my data, so I have interpreted it in light of my themes and my findings. So I say, Karina eloquently articulated how being incentivized to do the stewardship project, and then I use a little quote, we had to do something. And then engaging in the stewardship, and again, a little quote, actually starting it, allowed teachers to see their students' excitement. The students carried it from there, and witnessing the student ownership helped her overcome barriers. And then I have a couple of quotes about what those barriers were. And now I'm going to give another example. So I don't want to just leave it with one example, because people might be like, really? Maybe there's only one teacher who really talked about that, right? I'm providing evidence to convince people of why this was important and what way it was important. So I said others describe similar experiences. And then I have another quote by Lara about how it makes it worthwhile. And then again, I unpack it. Lara not only referred to students' engagement, but also their environmental responsibility. Now, if you notice, at the very beginning of this section, I talked about student engagement and environmental responsibility. I introduced those two kind of sub-themes. And so now I'm unpacking the second one slightly. It was a common theme among teachers who discussed the process. And then I talk a little bit about how this worked for teachers, that the Institute provided incentives to help them try it in the classroom, and then witnessing student reaction compensated for the amount of work. And then I gave a couple of mini quotes. Okay, this is another tool that qualitative research often use. So I use a couple of big quotes, but then when I'm like, hey, and others talked about this environmental thing, I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes about that. So again, you can see how basically I went deeply into all of this data. I found some things. I checked it against the data. I really wanted to make sure I was accurate. And then once I felt like I was relatively accurate, I am laying out the evidence for my reader that there's two major quotes to back up my two kind of little mini sub-themes to demonstrate the relationship between observing student engagement and overcoming barriers. And then I even gave a couple of little mini quotes to sort of like, yeah, there's other teachers saying these things. So that's another way, just another example of laying out qualitative findings. And I'm sort of unpacking for you the reasoning behind certain ways of laying things out. The past example I gave, the one from Watanabe, one of the things in there that I showed you was that she had at least two sub-themes or categories or codes within that theme that she's laying out. And she unpacks one and then she unpacks another. In this case, I didn't exactly do it that way. Definitely the first part up here pertains to one and the second part pertains to the other, but they're so similar. They are mostly about this relationship between engagement and overcoming barriers. So that's what I'm really focusing on, even though in one it's a little bit more about just watching the engagement, and the other it's a little bit more about the environmental stance of children. In the last few slides, I was talking about the whole picture of your pilot study report. I went over a table of how I create alignment across my study that I'm showing you. And then I went over some pieces that have to do with your methods and findings. One of the just activities you could do to work on alignment is to work a little bit on aligning your literature review. So this is something you can do. You don't have to do it. I'm not requiring that it's turned in, but it's something that helps you to align your literature review with your findings. This is something you do after you have your findings. All right, so you'll have your findings, your pilot study report, and you're thinking about what would you change in your literature review? What would you need to add? And in order to figure it out, you can choose a color for each of your main findings. So maybe your first theme is blue, second theme is green, etc. And then highlight your literature review using those colors when you discuss literature that has to do with that theme. So For example, maybe one of David's themes is, actually, I'm sorry, let me use Martine's because I talked to him recently. So one of Martine's themes is that the students really benefited from going through AVID in K-12 education, where they had a chance to apply for college together, right? So something about social capital or collaborative work on accessing college, all right? So he's going to go up to his literature review and highlight where he talks about that kind of thing. He may find out as he looks at his literature that he doesn't have very much literature on that theme, and then he might want to make a note of it. Okay, so you'll either highlight like, oh yeah, I have tons of literature on this, or yeah, actually I don't have literature on this. Now, for the pilot study, you don't need to write up this additional area of literature, but I think I would like you to make a couple of bullet points for the areas of literature you would like to develop, because I think that would be useful later on in your qualifying exam, number 2. So, and then if you have extra time, you can certainly look up some citations, you can do a little bit of development, but you don't need to. You just need to list, here's some areas of the literature that I think would be useful to develop based on these findings. Hi all, thanks to Allison for bringing up the question. Just to be perfectly clear, most of this process you will not turn into me. I don't want to see your Google Doc with highlighting all over the place. This is like a scaffold that you can use. It's an idea, a way of thinking about things. The one thing I do want to see is some bullet points around what you think you need. So adding to your literature anything that you think that you need, just some quick notes as to what you think you might need to support your findings. So that's the only thing I want you to add to your Google Docs. Nothing else will be sent to me. This is just kind of like, hey, here's a helpful scaffold. In the next slides, I will talk briefly about building a case for the trustworthiness or validity of your study. The first slide is qualitative and the second slide is quantitative. You can skip the one that does not pertain to your study. So in terms of trustworthiness or validity has to do with the purpose of the research. So the purpose of qualitative research is understanding phenomena and experiences in context. So deep understanding of particular experiences and phenomena of particular people. The idea behind qualitative research is that there are many interpretations of reality, and that yours as a researcher is just one interpretation, often based on other people's interpretations. But you can do some things to make sure that interpretation is as sound as you can get it. Number 1, you can discuss the process by which you've arrived at your conclusion. That's the analysis paragraph, along with the data collection and the other methods. But that's why the analysis paragraph is so important. You looked at your data, maybe you looked for particular themes, maybe there was some theory involved, maybe it was deductive, maybe it was inductive. What sorts of things were you hoping to find, etc. Number 2, you can have multiple sources or types of evidence regarding that reality that you're trying to understand. So you can have several interviews with different kinds of people. You can have interviews and observations. You can have documentary data, right? So if you have multiple sources of evidence, you can triangulate, that's what triangulation is called, between them. You can say, look, I interviewed, and Mary Kay did a good job of this. She talked about interviewing folks from the foundation and folks from the district. So you get 2 different perspectives and you can weigh them against each other. Number 3, you can surface your positionality. This is why we write a positionality paragraph, is to state, look, I'm coming into this process with a certain point of view and set of experiences, even though I will be, very much trying to understand oppositional cases and these kinds of things. I want to at least let the reader know this is how I'm coming in. And related to that, of course, is the idea of looking for opposite ideas. So always culling your data for, is there anything that kind of goes against A, the literature, B, the theory I might be using, or C, the collection of ideas that I'm starting to format, right? So if you think about the figure that I had in the article I was showing you, I looked specifically for things that went against that figure. Next, you can check your findings with a participant. That's called a member check, or with a colleague. So, hey, look, does this make sense to you? And it depends a lot on your findings, whether you want to check them with a participant. Or maybe you don't want to check all of them with a participant, you just want to check part of them with a participant. But I do a lot of member checks in my work with the Alameda County Office of Education. I have a colleague there that essentially reads everything that I write, and we make sure that it resonates in terms of what's really going on in practice. Finally, you can compare across 2 or more cases. And this is something that can be very useful. Like Melissa compared 2 classrooms, for example. You may look across 2 universities, like David looked at UC Berkeley and at Cal State East Bay in terms of student experiences. So that's something that, again, is sort of a form of triangulation where you can compare the experiences that are happening at 2 different places in order to get a little bit of a bigger sense of picture. So those are some things you can write about in your trustworthiness paragraph. All of this is from Merriam. There's a chapter in the back of the Merriam book for those who have it. For those who don't, I've uploaded an article in this week's folder. For quantitative research methods, validity and reliability are the way people talk about trustworthiness. And again, this has to do with the purpose of quantitative research, which is to generalize a relationship that you find in a sample to a broader population. So there's 3 forms that people talk about. One is internal validity, that it actually measures what it says it measures. So in other words, in terms of Daryl's survey, does it really measure financial literacy? Or does it measure something slightly different? Or does it measure financial literacy of adults, but not of college students, right? So what is this thing called financial literacy, and does it really measure it? And those are really important questions to ask. For Tacey's survey, same sort of thing. Does it really measure whatever construct Tacey is interested in? Finding out about technology use, for example. Reliability is the idea of replicability. At a very basic level, it means that if you give the same survey to the same people later, they'll give you the same answers. But in general, it also means that if someone was to replicate your study, they would find similar results, which is very squishy in social science research. And finally, external validity is it generalizes to other situations. So this mostly has to do with your sample selection. For example, if Daryl wants it to generalize, his survey to generalize to the entire population of CSU East Bay, he needs to be very careful about selecting a sample, a representative random sample of CSU East Bay students. If he wants it to generalize the entire CSU, he would need to select students from across several CSU institutions, right? Because just a selection of students from CSU East Bay would not generalize outside of CSU East Bay, although it could be argued that other students might be having similar situations. So to give another example, for open-ended questions such as Andrea's, internal validity is maybe a little bit more arguable, right? Because you're just asking, hey, what are the barriers, and students are replying in their own words. Reliability, though, may be a little bit less, if you ask them again, maybe it'll be slightly different. So the more, a lot of times, the more internal validity something has, the less external validity it has, right? Because internal validity, for example, asking open-ended interview questions could have a high internal validity because the person's actually really going on and on about their experiences, but it's hard to generalize to another situation. So therein lies the rub of quantitative research. So finally, we are moving into talking about how to write the conclusion. If you are really focused on findings right now and you don't want to hear about writing the conclusion, it's okay to come back to this early next week as you start writing the conclusion. It's not due until the end of next week on February 19th. But I wanted to give you a heads up if you want to get started on it early. So the conclusion is going to have two sections. The first section is a summary of your findings, and the second section is implications. The first section is a paragraph where you refer to the purpose and significance of the study and include the gap in the literature. And here, you may want to draw on what you wrote in your introduction. You saw that a little bit in the table I gave you where I laid out my introduction, my lit review, and all of those things. That in the conclusion, I sort of go back up to the main argument in the introduction, which is like, hey, this study needed to be done. And lo and behold, we found these fantastic things that shows the study needed to be done. A little bit redundant, but it helps make your argument. And then you want to summarize the main points of your findings. In your case, you'll mostly summarize the theme that you really talked about a lot. And then you might add in some main points as to how that theme relates to other themes. The next section, which might be, again, a couple of paragraphs, details what your findings mean for practitioners. You can be specific to this context, so what recommendations you would make in your context that you researched, and in general, like what do you think practitioners should do in general to address the situation? What should people do differently? As you do that, probably integrated, but sometimes its own paragraph, you will provide next steps or a call to action. So you're going to be making recommendations. And I'm going to show you in my example, this example paper that I'm using right now, how I did that. This is an example conclusion from the paper that I have uploaded that we've been following as an example this entire time. In the whole paper, it's called a discussion, but for here, I'm just going to pull out the pieces that are similar to what I'm asking you to do in the conclusion. So first you can see that I start by summarizing what happened in the quantitative changes, that they were substantive, that here's the areas where there was the greatest gain. And I use the word subscales, but essentially that's the same thing as constructs. And then you note here that I start tying it back to the literature. In many professional development efforts, demonstrate a much smaller effect size, and I have all these citations. And then here I state, hey, because we found these awesome findings, we are arguing that this is really pivotal to understand, that this is something that's really important to understand, and we're like shedding some light on this thing. Then I move into the qualitative findings. I have sort of an opening sentence. Our qualitative analysis explored the processes by which this happened. I make a reference to the literature, that it supports this thing about the literature. And then I start into my first theme. I summarize it. First, teachers reference the important role the Institute played as a source of new information that helped change their conceptions, blah, blah, blah. And then I elaborate on it just a little bit. The important role of the new knowledge and resources complement existing, the expertise that has been documented elsewhere. So I start connecting it back to the literature. Here's what I found. Here's how it connects back to the literature. And then I pull out some unique things that I found that happened in my context. In this case, teachers may have been especially receptive to the new knowledge because of their alignment and beliefs. And then I move on to the next theme. So I didn't leave all these paragraphs, but essentially that's how I laid out the summary. First this, second, here's the summary of the theme, and then here's how it connects to the literature, and here's why it's important. In terms of implications for practice, I had a couple of paragraphs on it. I'm just going to cover a little bit. The educators should carefully build programs that infuse useful knowledge, strategies, and tools, holds teachers to high implementation expectations, and simultaneously provides high support and provides opportunities for teachers to reflect on student learning. So I'm pulling out the pieces from this paper that seemed really pertinent to folks that are out there doing the work. This does not exactly align to the themes because some of the themes are more researchy and other ones are more helpful for practice. And then I just have some advice here. And then finally, summing things up, an infusion of knowledge was not enough. It took this iterative process with enactment, observation, and sense making within this teacher context. So I'm making this pretty, strong, like this, it's really important that we don't just think about infusing information. In order for teachers to shift their practice, in this case, it took this iterative process. So I'm trying to make a strong argument that just, divvying up information to teachers doesn't necessarily result in changes in practice. So that's an example for you of writing up a conclusion. And I'm sure there's other examples out there in the literature if you need some more.